Okay, so moving on to the next life course theory, we're going to look at Terrie Moffitt's work. So Moffitt works in pretty much the same way as David Farrington does in terms of doing these big prospective longitudinal studies, aiming to look at the differences between people who start committing offences and then stop versus those who continue offending throughout the course of their life. So again, we're answering this question: why do some people persist in committing crimes and other people desist? And Moffitt has a typology of antisocial delinquency, and essentially what she does is she takes apart the collection of people who commit crimes in adolescence and refers to the two groups as adolescence-limited perpetrators of delinquency versus life course persistent delinquents. Now, the difference between these two is fairly obvious in the way that they are described, in that those who are in the first group typically will commit offences in adolescence but then either grow out of it or for some other reason stop committing those offences, whereas the life course persistent guys will typically carry on committing offences throughout the life course. So we can really see links here to Farrington's work in the Cambridge study. So if you think about the fact that 41% of the sample in the Cambridge study committed an offence, that's a lot of people who are in this adolescence limited or in this kind of left hand portion of the graph, but you only had 7% of the sample committing more than 50% of all offences. So those 7% are probably life course persistent offenders. The vast majority of people who are committing offences in adolescence are limiting their offending behaviour to that period of time. And obviously that maps onto the age crime curve, where you have a lot of people committing relatively low level acts of delinquency in the early 20s, late teens, early 20s, and then a smaller number of people in later life carrying on and committing more offences. So you see that distinction there between adolescence limited and life course persistent offenders in the age crime curve and also in the Cambridge study. So just to kind of define what these typologies are, adolescence limited perpetrators are delinquent limited to their teenage years. So typically during adolescence they'll have kind of a spate of delinquent acts that they'll become engaged in, typically with other people that they are in communication with or in kind of social contact with, whereas life course persistent perpetrators will be delinquent and criminal early in their adolescence, but also then continuing into their adult lives. Now, the key distinction between these two groups seems to be in the causes of their offending behaviour. So it might be that some people who are more delinquent in a more persistent way have certain neuropsychological deficits that are causing that. So there's various different things that can be identified through neuropsychological tests. So looking at things like perceptions of risk, information processing, memory, whether or not people can make decisions in a way that is pro-social rather than antisocial. When given a range of different behavioural responses, can people choose the one that is going to get them the most pro-social outcome? Now, there's a battery of tests, there's a whole range of tests that people can do to look at these mental processes in a very specific and quantifiable way. So you can have tests of perception, you can have tests of information processing where you give people a bunch of different tasks to do all at the same time and see how they cope with that cognitive load and what happens to their decision-making processes under those conditions of cognitive load. What Moffitt's model suggests is that the differences between adolescence-limited perpetrators and those who are more life course persistent in their offending is that those whose delinquency is limited to their adolescence typically are engaging in social mimicry. So it might be that they are involved with a peer group that is delinquent, and essentially their biological and their social maturity don't match. So they might have the biological maturity in terms of being 14, 15, 16, but mentally and socially and emotionally they have a much lower level of maturity. So they engage in social mimicry. They kind of they're egging each other on, they're constantly kind of baiting each other to engage in delinquent behaviour. Now it gets to a point where people simply just grow up. They get that social maturity, they get that emotional maturity, and that's where you see those adolescence-limited perpetrators of delinquent acts just age out of crime. So that's where the adolescence-limited delinquency stops. In terms of life course persistent offending, though, these might be linked specifically to neuropsychological deficits. So we've already spoken about kind of planning, perception, information processing, decision making. These are all executive functions that we have. It could also be related to verbal function or IQ. So verbal function potentially is that people don't have the requisite communication skills to solve problems in a way that doesn't involve delinquency. They don't have the negotiation skills to construct kind of meaningful relationships where there's a back and forth that is pro-social rather than anti-social, for example. So the key difference here really is between adolescence-limited perpetrators being socially immature, whereas life course persistent perpetrators may have some kind of neuropsychological deficits that cause a more entrenched pattern of delinquent behaviour. Now there's a really important point here about person-environment interactions or gene-environment interactions, in that we might possess a range of different biological or neuropsychological propensities, but the social environment does exaggerate or mitigate those to some degree. So for example, it might be that people who have certain neuropsychological difficulties in terms of poor planning or impulsivity, or they get overwhelmed when there's lots of stuff that they need to process before making a decision. Now those people may have that propensity, that vulnerability to engaging in life course persistent offending behaviour. It might though be that they have a constraining personal life. They might have a family that stops them from engaging in kind of peer group related delinquency. So that would be a protective factor against that neuropsychologically driven risk factor. Now similarly, if you have boys, for example, with low neuropsychological indices in terms of planning or impulsivity, and they have a poor home life, so that might be a lack of supervision from parents, it might be poor attainment in school. Now they're on average 4 times more likely to engage in aggression than those who either have the poor neuropsychological functioning or a poor home life. So these things interact in some way where they can mitigate or exaggerate the risk factors. Now think about protective factors in this sense, in that you have an interaction between risk factors and protective factors, or 2 risk factors acting together. These are all interactions between different traits and different factors that might either increase or decrease someone's likelihood to commit an offence. Okay, so just to reiterate, you've got these 2 different approaches to studying life course theories in terms of how people gain access to kind of criminal associates and begin to commit criminal offences. David Farrington's work in the Cambridge study identifies a range of different risk factors, whether they are vulnerabilities in the home or in terms of your neuropsychological makeup. Terrie Moffitt's work identifies a difference between adolescence-limited and life course persistent perpetrators of delinquent acts. And the important thing really to consider in both of these cases is the interaction between risk factors on the one hand, so these things that serve to increase people's risk of offending behaviour, and protective factors and promotive factors on the other hand. So promotive factors being those things that directly reduce delinquency, and protective factors being those that act against a risk factor. Understanding those interactions and understanding how different factors can mitigate or exaggerate risk factors is a real key thing to be doing in the area of life course theory, particularly in relation to how people start committing offences, but more importantly how people stop committing offences in either late adolescence or early adulthood.